So let's kick off with our encore. Betsy, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you again for all of your support during the day. And we're really looking forward to this final session where we're going to bring everything together. So with that being said, the stage is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Phil. I'm amazed at how quickly the time has gone by. But here we are at the last session. And yeah, so today we're going to talk about, some of the common obstacles to category planning and how you can overcome those. As Phil said in the beginning, for folks who maybe weren't on yet, I've noticed that sometimes the terms category management and sourcing are used interchangeably. One time I was talking to an attendee at a procurement conference, and she said, literally one day she was a sourcing manager, and then the next day they rebranded the role as category manager, but her job didn't change. And, I think that is representative of a lot of procurement organizations today, where you're kind of doing everything all the time, versus splitting out category management and the development of a category strategy as a planning, strategic, forward-looking exercise separate from the execution of individual sourcing events. No matter how complex and strategic those sourcing events can be, it's different than a category strategy. So I am interested in, finding out organizations that, do you use those terms interchangeably? Do you have a separate category management process and a separate sourcing process? How do those processes intertwine? But on this slide, what I really want to call out are some of the key reasons that we hear for why organizations struggle with category planning. And I think first and foremost, it's just too complex. It's sort of like, the old adage of, how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. It's the category strategy is the elephant. And, it just seems like too much to take on. And, one of the reasons why it can often be too much to take on is because you just don't have access to the baseline information that you need to build a successful strategy. So, whether that's lacking the market insights, you don't know what's going on in the market, you can't see, you don't have visibility to your spend, you're lacking data from your suppliers, maybe you don't know what's happening within the supply market to know, who are the major players, what are their positions of power, is it a buyer's market, is it a supplier's market? And so we've talked a lot today about, different elements of this. We started off talking about data. We talked about, managing complex categories and how that the varying complexity can inform your strategy. The challenging and elusive stakeholders, the fact that, you oftentimes will have stakeholders, particularly in categories that are not traditionally managed by procurement, or maybe where procurement doesn't really have, it's a bit cliche, but a true seat at the table. So when I think of, marketing, for example, the procurement marketing relationships have, I think, grown significantly in the last 5 or 10 years, but historically procurement was really more of an execution arm. Same thing with things like legal services and HR benefits, some of those sort of sensitive categories where having that market insight and really understanding that market in a very, detailed way is really critical to ensuring that you have that seat at the table. And, I think what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that all of this lack of clarity, maybe the lack of insight, the lack of visibility, it just leads to paralysis. You don't have what you need to do something the way that you think it needs to be done, so you just do nothing. And I know for me personally, this is sort of maybe a little bit more of a philosophical point, but clarity is a direct linkage to motivation. If you don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, it's kind of hard to muster the energy to, dig in your, roll up your sleeves and dig your hands into it. So, I think having the right data, the right insights, the right supplier information, and obviously building relationships with stakeholders, can at least start you down the path. But the point of today's session is to say, okay, well, what happens if you're in this situation? Like, what if all of these conditions exist? Where do I start? So why don't we move to the next slide? And so what we like to do, when we're talking about category strategies with clients is, breaking it down into 3 elements. First of all, it makes it feel more achievable, like you can make progress on these. But also, the goal of a category strategy isn't necessarily to, build a 5-year approach to how you're going to manage this spend through all different kinds of market conditions and detail out every single, potential sourcing event that you're going to run and have all the market information all in one place. I mean, that would be great. But for many organizations, it's just not realistic. So, but, you shouldn't say to yourself, okay, well, that means I can't do a category strategy. So the elements on this page are really intended to try to distill down, those key elements of a category strategy. And no, it doesn't have to be 100 pages. And in fact, what we're going to see in a minute is it really only has to be 1 page. So these 3 elements: category profile, the market assessment, and the category plan. So the profile is really, what are you buying? So how are you defining those categories? And this is important because not everybody looks at things the same way. In some organizations, as Kim was mentioning earlier, contingent labor is part of HR spend. In some organizations, it's not. There can be IT elements of marketing spend. Does that sit in marketing? Does it sit in IT? So having a clear understanding of the category definition and the subcategories and what that includes. Obviously, you want to know who the stakeholders are. These are the people that you're going to want to work with to build your strategy. You can't do this in a vacuum. You can't, I worked with a client once that literally spent a year and probably a lot of money working with an external consultant, not me, building category strategies, and they just sat on a shelf because they didn't work with the business to create them. And so therefore the business was like, well, I didn't have any buy-in to this. I didn't have any input to this. So, it's irrelevant to me. Having a good understanding of who those stakeholders are, obviously your spend. And the key here is that, again, getting back to, doesn't have to be 100 pages or 1 page. Same thing with data. Use the Pareto principle. 80% accuracy is good enough for building a strategy. We all use data for different things. The data that you would use to establish the baseline for your category, if you can get to 80% accuracy, that is absolutely good enough. You want to understand who are the current suppliers. What's your current status with them? What's the health of the relationship? Have you had ongoing issues? So this really just helps establish the baseline for the current state and really the volume or the profile of this category. The second point is really around the market assessment. And, this is where a lot of the external research comes in. So we've talked today a lot about, industry analysis, having a good understanding of the industry that you're buying in. In a minute, we'll show an example of Porter's 5 forces, the pestle analysis. These are helpful to really analyzing the competitive environment within a particular industry and making sure that you have a good understanding of all the different forces that are combining to, is it a supplier powered industry? Meaning, does the supplier have the power? Does the buyer have the power? Richard mentioned the SWOT analysis. Absolutely, also a good, a great tool to use, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to be able to really determine your position within an industry, but also understand, where you may have strength and where you may have challenges. Looking at the competitive landscape, the availability of substitutes, and the key market forces. Jake talked a few minutes ago about where can you get data to formulate a should cost, and that 1 page of where to find the data, absolutely, you can fit that right into this process as well. So talking to peers, industry publications, industry events, trade conferences, trade events, trade publications, all of those are a great source. for this type of information. If you're, responsible for sourcing marketing as a category, absolutely you should be getting some of the marketing trade publications and participating in those events. And then lastly, it's taking that category profile and the market assessment itself and formulating that into your overall category plan. So this is really where you take what you know about the category, what you know about the market, and you formulate that into a plan that really consists of, it's really two major things: business priorities. So what are the key things that the business wants to achieve, and ultimately what this plan is going to help them achieve. And then the second is, what are the specific initiatives that you are going to enact in order to achieve those priorities? And this is where I think a lot of procurement organizations and category managers kind of freeze. It's one thing for me to go off on my own and build the category profile and do some research on the market assessment. But this third piece, the category plan, you absolutely cannot do on your own. You have to, this is where the stakeholder engagement has to happen. And not only that, but I think, also having accountability among the team that's going to be implementing these initiatives in the form of performance objectives. And, I've seen procurement organizations, and actually I've seen category strategies where the objectives in the category strategy extend outside of procurement. So, you've got everybody who is part of that cross-functional team, who could be, procurement, it could be a number of different stakeholders, there could be, different people that are part of the supply chain organization, part of operations, who are all going to play a role in executing that strategy, and their performance objectives reflect their role in that process. And I would say that is really the mark of a more mature, more advanced procurement organization. If you've gotten the rest of the organization buying into that concept, but if you can really use the opportunity of a category strategy to align on performance objectives across everybody who's going to impact that strategy, that is a significant achievement. So why don't we move to the next page, and we'll talk now about our one-page summary. And Conrad actually teed this up beautifully in the chat, saying the most powerful part of the strategies are the one-page summary. And he's absolutely right. So when you look at what we had on the prior page, those three elements, the category profile, the market assessment, and the category plan, you really should be able to put all of this in a one-page document. And what that's going to do is really two things. Obviously give you what we call a walking around document that, of course, many of us are in a virtual environment now, so you're virtually walking around, but having this one-page summary literally with you at all times. And, I've been in situations where I've had these and I've printed them out and I put them into my notebook that I take with me to every meeting. And if I happen to run into a stakeholder that I was like, oh, I need 5 minutes with that person to review this with them, pull out my one-page summary. Hey, can you take a quick look at this? I wanted to, really kind of cover these 2 points with you and get your thoughts. So having a category strategy in a one-page summary, obviously you can have supporting documents, but the whole goal of this is to try to demystify this idea that category strategies have to be these massively complex 100-page documents that you spend 6 months working on, and you've got all of this underlying data. And what we would suggest is that when you really look at the key elements of a category strategy, it comes down to really what's on this page. So I won't go box by box. I think most of this is pretty, pretty self-explanatory. But I think, again, what is important here is that you do have the underlying data, and that you use this as an opportunity to work with stakeholders to get their buy-in, particularly at the bottom, in the bottom section, when you're documenting the business priorities and the opportunities, the key initiatives and the action plan for the current year, as well as later years. And, I fully recognize that we're in an environment right now where, I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day who said that, they got a supplier proposal that said it was valid for 1 day. I had never heard of that before. I mean, my jaw dropped. I'm like, 1 day? I mean, usually at least 30, 60 days. You know, it used to be you could get people to lock in pricing for 120 days, 6 months. So 1 day, and that shows you how volatile the market is. So, you know, I'm not here to suggest that, oh yeah, you can ignore everything that's happening in the market and still execute, you know, this category strategy without any issue. Certainly, more so than ever, I think it needs to be consistently refreshed. And, you know, category strategies are living documents. They're not intended to be static documents that you put together based on one data set at that point in time, and then, you know, they just sit on a shelf. They're intended to be living documents. And I think one of procurement's key roles is really in taking the initiative to continually update that document and demonstrate that you've got your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the market. You understand what's happening in the organization. I mean, the business priorities may completely change in 3 months. And, you know, you're taking the initiative to update this document and send it back out to stakeholders. Does this align with your objectives? Does this align with, you know, the way you see the market today? I think can go a long way, again, towards really, you know, adding value and you know, being a strategic partner. Planned sources of value. Bill asked the question, what do we mean by that? So planned sources of value is another way of saying savings. So where is savings going to come from? Is it going to come from, you know, rationalizing your supply base? Is it going to come from, you know, using a market index to, you know, benchmark your pricing? Is it going to come from a should cost analysis? So it's really intended to say, where do we see the savings coming from in this category? And I think, you know, again, talking or going back to the conversation with Alex, you know, this is so much more important now, I think, than ever before, because we're in a situation where we're almost always, you know, not almost always, in many situations, we're facing price increases. So using this category strategy to define where we think the value is going to come from, and getting people's minds wrapped around the fact that, you know, we might not see any hard cost savings in this category for the next 6 to 12 months. We may only be able to just, you know, the best we can do with a ton of effort might be to stay even to where we are today. So using this document as a way to capture those market forces and capture what's happening in the market, to then have that conversation early so that, you know, you're not running into surprises. And also allows you to plan where you have, you know, categories or contracts, that are coming up for renewal. If you see that there are price increases that have been happening over the last, you know, 2-3 quarters in a row, and you've got a supplier that's willing to extend that contract, go for it. I mean, that's, you know, that's your strategy right there. So I do want to spend 2 more minutes just talking about Porter's 5 forces, because it's again, it's kind of a procurement 101 for a lot of organizations, but it may also not be extremely well understood by others. So just quickly on the next slide. So this is essentially the Porter's 5 forces model. It's a way that you can analyze competitive positions and industries. We also talked about PESTLE, which is also an acronym. It's political, economic, social, something, and as well as the SWOT analysis that Bill mentioned. But basically, these are the forces, and it's saying that, you know, basically in an industry, there's always supplier power and buyer power, and what you're really trying to determine is kind of who has the upper hand, and then what could happen to impact that position. So this is a really a very data intensive, research intensive, but extremely effective way of determining your position in an industry to inform your negotiation and your category strategy. I did include in the last slide just an example of one of these that we did for one of our clients. So on the next slide, Pip, this just gives you an example. You know, basically, oh, somehow that high-low got. switch.
And Betsy, don't feel rushed for me. I came in because I've got a couple of questions to add before we wrap, but we've got a few minutes left yet.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I was thinking I still had a few. Thanks, Bill. But yeah, so basically, you're looking then at each one of those forces and you are assessing, is it a high impact or a low impact? So if you're in an industry, for example, where the threat of new entrants is fairly low and you've got significant buyer power, then you don't have to necessarily worry about new entrants impacting that power. So again, this is more so for you to take away and examine, use if it's helpful to you. Again, it's just another way to sort of establish what's happening in an industry, establish your position in an industry. And when I say industry, I really mean category. So when you think about the industries that are relevant to the categories that you support today, taking really a look at the market landscape for each one of those categories and assessing, what's your power? Where do you sit in it? And it could be based on spend, it could be based on relationship, it could be based on the complexity of your requirement. And so, having tools like this, along with your data, along with, your category benchmarks, your market benchmarks, your should cost analysis, the techniques that Alex talked about, can really help you kind of put all of this together into a cohesive category strategy. So I would love to, take your questions, Phil. They're always insightful. So happy to.
And please, anyone pop some in the chat as well. We have a couple more minutes to go. One of my questions actually was, as I was seeing the Porter's 5 forces, you kind of think, you talked about the one pager, about really the ability to succinctly put all of the data and the insights into one page that you kind of walk around with you, and that you can present to senior stakeholders, or from an organizational perspective, you can present 10 category strategies in 10 slides when you're in an exec review versus having to dig deeper into all the weeds. But there's obviously a lot of work that goes behind that one pager, and the example you've shown here of 5 forces is one of those. How much should we be showing our stakeholders at that operational level and involving our stakeholders at that operational level, involving them in doing all this, the details, or should they just be seeing the one pager as well?
Well, I think that this is a great opportunity to engage your stakeholders at an operational level early in the process. Mm-hmm. Let's be honest, sometimes it depends on whether they're willing to give us time. And sometimes it's not until you show them, some measure of the value that you can produce that they're willing to now partner with you. So, you may say, let's say, and Pip, actually, if you wouldn't mind going back to the one pager category strategy, I think it's back 2 slides, you might say, I'm going to build this category profile myself. And maybe I'm going to, take a shot at, I'm going to fill in the spend data. I'm going to, look at, I'm going to fill in some of the market assessment, but I'm going to leave the bottom section just completely blank. Mm-hmm. And, and then at that point, say to your stakeholders, okay, here's what I've done so far. I'd love your input on, whether you think I'm on the right track. And then, I'd really like to sit down and fill out this bottom section together. Because, a lot of times it's just a matter of whether they're willing to engage with you at this level. And, a lot of that just has to do with how procurement is perceived in the organization, mm-hmm. Whether or not you have your leadership support and the company's leadership support for this type of effort. Yeah,
and, coming to the table with insights, I think that they don't have is a really powerful way, because oftentimes especially when you're trying to convince people that, why are you here? Because I've bought this for, myself for all these times and never had a problem and I'm the expert. Being able to come to the table with different insights or different contexts on the insights that they have helps, I think, put in the stakeholders' mind that perhaps I could learn something, perhaps there's some benefit of doing that, and then kind of building on that as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Alex talked a lot about, gave us some really great techniques for how we can demonstrate that insight.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I mean, nobody wants to have those types of tough conversations with a supplier. And, you know, so our willingness to say, hey, we'll do the research, we'll take this on. I think in and of itself, I mean, aside from the fact it's saving time, it's also saving time, or it's saving them from having to have a potentially difficult conversation they don't really want to have.
Right.
So yeah, I think coming to the table with some of those insights, and, you know, we've talked a lot today about, you know, Procurement 101, and, you know, I'm, you know, a big proponent of this, and the fact that there are certain capabilities and techniques that procurement has, in some ways, we've had those taken away from us. In other ways, we've given them up. And, you know, the ability and willingness to come back to the table with, you know, just doing our homework on who are we spending, you know, what are we spending and with whom? And when was the last time a contract was renegotiated? And did you know we have 5 contracts with the same supplier with different rates? It's not to point fingers at anybody. It's to say, look, there's value in looking at this. Yeah. And I'm willing to do the hard work, but I need you to partner with me. And you know, because I want to make sure my strategy is focused on what you want to achieve.
So we have one question that came in the chat, I see, from Krupa, who asked, can you help me understand how we link this to supplier performance management?
Yeah, well, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, that doesn't sound right, but it's my belief that category strategies should contain a component of supplier management. Mm-hmm. And, you know, back to one of the concepts we were talking about earlier with Rihanna and Kim is that, you know, what you do in the category management and the sourcing process today, and the way that you manage that after that strategy has been executed is going to inform the next time you implement that strategy. So it becomes a cycle. And so I think being able to say, for example, if my strategy on, you know, if part of my category strategy is to rationalize my spend and reduce the number of suppliers, that makes supplier performance management so much more critical. So, you know, you can actually, I've seen category strategies that talk about how you're going to manage suppliers. So what types of ongoing reviews are you going to have? Mm-hmm. What types of performance metrics do they need to be providing? How often are you going to review that? Who's going to review it? Are you going to do surveys? So I think an element of category strategy absolutely should include how you're going to manage the suppliers that are a part of that strategy, because they're as big a part of the strategy in many cases as anyone.
Yeah, making sure you got that feedback loop that you said about it being a cycle, that feedback loop that then ties into what you said earlier when you started talking about the one pager, is it's a living document. So if you have that feedback loop from others in the organization, even when it comes to supplier performance management or governance or whatever it may be that you've actually set out that you're going to manage that supplier, or just taking anecdotal comments and or evidence that you get from key stakeholders, and then ensuring that the strategy is continually updated to take account of those things is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Betsy, I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody from the Procurability team for supporting our very first Category Palooza. I think that everybody's safely tucked up on the tour bus now, are ready to depart. We, of course, thank you everybody for joining us in the comments, participating in the comments. And also, if you weren't in the comments, but you were just engaging in the conversation, hopefully listening to some things that you can go and put into practice, because that's really important to us. Everything we try and do is to make things as actionable as possible. We, of course, would love any feedback that you have on the event. So you can always just pop that in the comments, or you can email it to us. contact@artofprocurement.com is always the way to get hold of us. And last but not least, Betsy, if anybody would like to reach out to you, to any of your peers that they have seen today, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I'm going to throw my email address in the chat. So it's my first initial, last name, BPANCIK, Pancic, @procurability.com. You know, we love talking about procurement. So if you have no interest in using a consultant or engaging us for services, you know, give me a call anyway. We really, this is our favorite thing. So we hope that this has been beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, you know, Betsy and I have known each other for a number of years, and we've both very passionate, and I know that Betsy is very passionate about procurement. So what she says there isn't, is from the heart. So take her up on that opportunity. Finally, I just want to say that if you do want to watch any of the sessions again, please, we're going to send out an email. So we'll send out an email with links to watch again. So if there were sessions that you weren't able to watch earlier today, or if you wanted to go back and check out what some of those slides said, or whatever that may be, then look out for that email in the next couple of days. So with that being said, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Phil, and Art of Procurement, and thanks everyone for attending.
Take care, everyone.